October 25th, 1944. The Philippine Sea off the island of Samar. Commander Ernest Evans stood on the bridge of USS Johnston, a Fletcher-class destroyer displacing just 2,100 tons. Through his binoculars, he could see something that made his blood run cold. 4 Japanese battleships, the largest over 70,000 tons, accompanied by 6 heavy cruisers and their escorts. His ship carried 5-inch guns. The lead enemy battleship, Yamato, mounted 18-inch rifles that could hurl shells weighing nearly 3,000 pounds over 25 miles. Each of Yamato's 9 main guns was larger than Johnston's entire armament. The rational decision was to run, to make smoke, to hide. Ernest Evans gave the order to attack. To understand this moment, you need to know who Ernest Evans was. Born in 1908 in Pawnee, Oklahoma, he was part Cherokee, part Creek Indian. His childhood friends remembered a boy who never backed down from a fight, even when outmatched. At the Naval Academy, his classmates called him tough but fair, a man who led from the front. When he took command of Johnston in October 1943, he gave his crew a speech they would never forget. "This is going to be a fighting ship," he told them. "I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to come along had better get off right now." Not a single man left. The morning of October 25th began in relative calm. The previous day, American carriers had been launching strikes against Japanese forces, and Johnston had been screening the escort carriers of Taffy 3, a small unit of 6 escort carriers and 7 destroyers and destroyer escorts. These weren't the big fleet carriers that had won Midway. These were CVEs, escort carriers sailors nicknamed combustible, vulnerable, expendable. Built on merchant ship hulls, they carried fewer aircraft, moved slower, had thinner armor. They existed to provide air support for the ground troops on Leyte, not to fight surface actions. At 6:45 in the morning, lookouts on Johnston spotted the distinctive pagoda masts of Japanese battleships on the horizon. Within minutes, the radio crackled with urgent voices. Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3, couldn't believe the reports. Japanese battleships weren't supposed to be here. American intelligence had assured everyone that the Japanese fleet was scattered, that the threat had been neutralized. But here they were, Admiral Kurita's Center Force, the most powerful surface action group the Japanese Navy could assemble. 4 battleships, including the mighty Yamato and her sister Nagato, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The Americans were catastrophically outgunned. The escort carriers' only weapons were their aircraft, and many planes were already away on support missions. The screening destroyers and destroyer escorts were the only things standing between Kurita's guns and the defenseless carriers. As you see on the screen now, the size comparison was staggering. Yamato displaced 72,000 tons, longer than 3 football fields. Johnston displaced 2,100 tons, 376 feet long. Yamato's armor belt was 16 inches thick. Johnston's was barely an inch in places. Commander Evans didn't wait for orders. At 6:50, before Admiral Sprague issued any commands, Johnston was already accelerating to flank speed, making 35 knots, heading straight toward the Japanese fleet. Lieutenant Robert Hagen, the gunnery officer, later recalled thinking his captain had lost his mind. "We're a tin can charging battleships," he remembered thinking. "This is suicide." But Evans was calm, almost serene. He'd spent the night before writing a letter to his wife, talking about their future, about seeing their children grow up. He knew exactly what he was doing. Johnston opened fire at 18,000 yards, an extreme range for her 5-inch guns, but Evans wanted to force the Japanese to react, to divide their attention. At the same time, he ordered smoke. Thick chemical smoke poured from Johnston's generators, creating a screen to hide the vulnerable carriers. Then came the call every man dreaded: armor-piercing shells incoming. The Japanese had spotted Johnston and answered with their massive guns. What happened next defied naval warfare doctrine. As shells from Yamato and Nagato began to fall around Johnston, creating geysers of water 200 feet high, Evans didn't turn away. He turned in, charging directly at the Japanese line. His plan was audacious, bordering on insane. Get close enough that the battleship's main guns couldn't depress low enough to hit him, launch torpedoes, then use Johnston's superior maneuverability to dodge and weave while continuing to fire. Seaman First Class Bill Mercer was in the forward engine room when the first hit came. The entire ship shuddered, he later wrote in his diary. Metal screamed. I could hear men yelling topside. We didn't slow down. If anything, the engine telegraphs rang for more speed. Down in that steel box, not knowing what was happening above, just knowing we were racing towards something terrible, that was the longest few minutes of my life. At 10,000 yards, Johnston launched her 10 torpedoes, all of them holding nothing in reserve. Evans aimed for the heavy cruiser Kumano, leading the Japanese right flank. Through the smoke and spray, Johnston's crew watched the torpedoes run true. Minutes later, a massive explosion. Kumano's bow disintegrated, blown completely off. The heavy cruiser slewed out of formation, dead in the water, eventually forced to withdraw. One destroyer had just crippled a heavy cruiser 10 times its size. But Johnston paid a price. As she turned away after launching torpedoes, 3 14-inch shells from Battleship Congo smashed into her. The first hit the bridge, killing or wounding nearly everyone there. Commander Evans was thrown against the bulkhead. His fingers sheared off his left hand, shrapnel tearing into his body. The second shell destroyed the port engine room, killing everyone inside instantly. The third shell knocked out 3 of the 5 gun mounts. Johnston was wounded, her speed cut to 17 knots, listing, bleeding oil, and smoke. Most captains would have withdrawn. Most crews would have been shattered. Instead, Evans, bleeding badly, his left hand a mangled ruin, returned to the aft steering station and kept fighting. As you see on the screen now, Johnston continued to fire with her remaining 2 gun mounts, targeting Japanese heavy cruisers with a ferocity that made them believe they faced something much larger than a single crippled destroyer. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, captain of the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, watched Johnston's attack from 3 miles away. He later testified that Johnston's actions inspired his own decision to charge. If a destroyer already shot to pieces was still fighting, he thought, how could we run? Samuel B. Roberts would also attack and would also be sunk, but not before firing every shell and torpedo she had. The battle became a chaotic melee, American destroyers darting through smoke, firing torpedoes at point-blank range, Japanese battleships and cruisers maneuvering violently to avoid torpedo tracks, their formations broken, and through it all, Johnston kept firing. Her remaining guns targeted the bridge superstructures of Japanese cruisers, the most vulnerable part of their armored shells. She couldn't penetrate their armor belts, but she could kill officers, destroy fire control, blind their spotters. Chief Gunner's Mate Floyd Bowers was in charge of one of the 2 remaining gun mounts. We fired so fast the barrel glowed red, he later wrote. Ammunition handlers passed shells in a blur. Nobody thought about being scared. We were too busy. The Japanese seemed confused that we were still fighting. Their shells kept missing because they expected us to run. We kept getting closer instead. Around 9:30, Johnston found herself alone, separated from the other destroyers by smoke and confusion. She emerged from a smoke bank directly into the path of a Japanese destroyer squadron. 7 destroyers at close range, all turning to engage. Evans ordered hard left rudder, bringing Johnston's 2 remaining guns to bear. For 20 minutes, Johnston fought 7 destroyers simultaneously, dodging torpedoes, taking hits, giving as good as she got. Ensign John Mostrom was on the aft gun mount during this phase. I could see Japanese sailors on their decks, he recalled. That's how close we were. Our shells were hitting them. Their shells were hitting us. It was like 2 boxers standing toe-to-toe, just swinging, except they had 7 boxers and we had 1, and we were already bleeding from the first round. But something remarkable happened. The Japanese destroyer squadron, despite their overwhelming advantage, withdrew. They'd taken casualties from Johnston's accurate fire and couldn't believe this burning, listing American destroyer was still fighting. Japanese commanders later wrote that they believed Johnston must be protecting something valuable behind the smoke, that this was a trap, that American heavy forces must be nearby. No destroyer, they reasoned, would fight like this unless it was covering something. They were wrong. Johnston was fighting like this because Ernest Evans had promised his crew this would be a fighting ship, and he kept his promises. By 10 o'clock, Johnston was dying. She'd taken dozens of hits. All power was lost. Steering was gone. The remaining gun mount could still fire, but had to be aimed manually and loaded by hand. Most of the crew was wounded. The ship listed 25 degrees and was settling by the bow. The ocean poured into dozens of holes. And still, Evans refused to give the order to abandon ship. "We have ammunition left," he said. "We can still fight." Lieutenant Hagen made his way to the aft steering station where Evans commanded the ship. The captain's left hand was wrapped in bloody bandages. Shrapnel wounds covered his body. He'd lost a tremendous amount of blood, but his eyes were clear, focused. Hagen later said that Evans seemed at peace, like he'd found exactly where he was meant to be. "Sir, we need to abandon ship," Hagen said. Evans looked at the Japanese fleet, still visible through the smoke, then at his crew. "Prepare to abandon," he said quietly. "But we keep the guns firing until the last possible moment." At 10:10, with water reaching the main deck, Evans finally gave the order. Abandon ship. Men slid down lines into the oil-covered sea. Johnston was so low in the water they barely had to jump. Survivors watched as their ship, still defiantly afloat, slowly rolled over. At 10:45, USS Johnston sank. Of the 327 men who'd crewed her, 186 died, including Commander Ernest Evans. His body was never recovered. But here's what makes this story extraordinary. Johnston's suicidal charge, her refusal to break off, her aggressive attacks, achieved something no one expected. Admiral Kurita, commanding the Japanese center force, became convinced he faced much heavier opposition than he actually did. The ferocity of the American destroyer attacks, the torpedo hits, the constant harassment, made him believe he'd stumbled into a major fleet engagement. At 10:20, with Taffy 3's carriers still afloat and escaping, Kurita ordered his fleet to withdraw. The Japanese had won the tactical engagement. They'd sunk Johnston, destroyer Hull, destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, and 2 escort carriers. But they'd lost the strategic battle. The transports at Leyte Gulf, packed with American soldiers and supplies, remained untouched. The landing continued, and all because a few destroyers and destroyer escorts decided to charge battleships. Japanese officers later expressed bewilderment at American tactics. Commander Katsumi Tomio, executive officer of heavy cruiser Tone, wrote in his report, "The American destroyers attacked with such ferocity and disregard for their own survival that we concluded they must be covering a major fleet force. No commander would sacrifice destroyers so recklessly unless protecting something of great value. We expected American battleships to emerge from the smoke at any moment. They never came because they were never there. The survivors of Johnston spent 2 days in the oil-covered water before rescue. Sharks circled. Men died of wounds, exposure, exhaustion." Seaman Bill Mercer later wrote, "We joke that we survived the battle just to be eaten by sharks. But whenever we got too scared, someone would say, 'Remember the old man. Remember Commander Evans. He showed us how to fight. Figured we should show him how to survive.'" Out of the 141 men who made it off Johnston, another 5 died before rescue. Lieutenant Hagen was among the survivors. He spent the rest of his life telling Johnston's story. In interviews decades later, he'd still choke up talking about Commander Evans. "People ask me if he was reckless," Hagen said in a 1985 interview. "They don't understand. He calculated everything. He knew if we ran, those carriers were dead. If we attacked, we might die, but we'd buy time. Maybe those carriers would escape. Maybe their planes would come back and help. He bet our lives that our sacrifice would matter." And he was right. The Navy agreed. Commander Ernest Edwin Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first Native American in the Navy to receive it. The citation reads in part, "Outgunned and outweighed, he unhesitatingly took on a force many times superior to his own, closing to within range of enemy shells and torpedoes in order to give the vulnerable carriers time to escape." His actions were in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service. But awards don't capture the full impact. Admiral Sprague, commanding Taffy 3, later wrote, "The courageous action of my screen ships gave the carriers time to launch aircraft and escape. Without their sacrifice, particularly Johnston's initial attack, which disrupted the Japanese formation, we would have been annihilated. American forces would have lost control of Leyte Gulf. The invasion may have failed." Think about that for a moment. One destroyer's decision to charge instead of run may have changed the outcome of the entire Philippine campaign. If Kurita's battleships had reached the transports at Leyte Gulf, they could have massacred the landing force. Thousands of American soldiers would have died on the beaches or in sinking transports. The liberation of the Philippines might have been delayed by months, perhaps longer. The war in the Pacific could have dragged on into 1946. Japanese historians later confirmed Kurita's confusion. Admiral Kurita was expecting a major engagement, wrote Japanese naval historian Tamichi Hara in 1961. The aggressive American destroyer attacks convinced him this was happening. When his flagship Yamato was forced to maneuver radically to avoid torpedoes from Johnston, when heavy cruiser Kumano was knocked out of action, when his formations were disrupted and his ships scattered, he concluded the Americans had more forces than they actually did. His decision to withdraw was based on faulty intelligence, but that intelligence came from American fighting spirit, not American numbers. The wreck of USS Johnston was discovered in October 2019, 75 years after she sank. The wreck lies in 21,000 feet of water, the deepest shipwreck ever found at that time. Video footage shows her hull largely intact, resting upright on the ocean floor. You can still see the damage from Japanese shells. The forward section is twisted and torn, but her stern, where Commander Evans fought from after the bridge was destroyed, remains recognizable. And remarkably, her ensign staff still stands, though the flag itself is long gone. When the wreck was discovered, the few surviving crew members were in their 90s. Seaman Bill Mercer, then 94, watched the footage with tears streaming down his face. "That was home," he said. "That was where boys became men, where we learned what we were capable of. I'm glad she's found. Glad people will remember." Mercer died in 2020, one of the last Johnston survivors. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was the largest naval engagement in history, involving more than 200 ships. But when naval historians discuss it, they always come back to Johnston, not to the battleships or carriers, but to a single destroyer that chose to charge when every tactical manual said to run. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, called the destroyer and destroyer escort actions at Samar one of the most gallant naval actions in American history and an inspiration to all who serve. But perhaps the most fitting tribute comes from an unexpected source. In 1960, former Japanese Admiral Takeo Kurita was interviewed about the battle. When asked about the American destroyer that first attacked his fleet, the one that torpedoed Kumano and disrupted his formations, Kurita paused for a long moment. "I thought we would sink her quickly," he said through a translator. "Instead, she fought like something 3 times her size. Even after we damaged her badly, she kept attacking. I have faced many enemies in my career. I never faced one braver than that destroyer. If all the Americans fought like that ship," the translator quoted Kurita as saying, "we could never have won, no matter how many ships we had." Today, the Navy hasn't forgotten. Every year on October 25th, Navy destroyers around the world hold ceremonies honoring Johnston and the other ships lost at Samar. Young sailors who weren't born until 60 years after the battle gather to remember. They read the names of the dead. They read Commander Evans's speech about going in harm's way. They're reminded that size doesn't determine courage, that sometimes the smallest ship can make the biggest difference. There's a lesson in Johnston's story that transcends naval history. It's about leadership. Ernest Evans could have obeyed the letter of his orders, stayed back, made smoke, preserved his ship. No one would have court-martialed him. Instead, he saw what needed to be done and did it, knowing the cost. He led from the front, took the hits meant for others, kept fighting when most would have quit. His crew followed him into hell because he'd already shown them he'd never ask them to go anywhere. He wouldn't go first. It's also about sacrifice. Those men on Johnston knew they were probably going to die. They did it anyway because sailors on those carriers, soldiers in those transports, they had families too. They had futures. Someone had to buy them time. Johnston's crew decided it would be them. That kind of selflessness, that willingness to trade your life for strangers, that's rare. It's precious. It should never be forgotten. And it's about underestimating your opponent. The Japanese had bigger ships, bigger guns, more armor. On paper, they should have swept the Americans aside. But fighting spirit doesn't fit on a spreadsheet. Courage doesn't show up in displacement tonnage. The Japanese expected the Americans to be rational, to calculate odds, to preserve forces. Instead, they got Ernest Evans and men like him who calculated that some things matter more than survival. 76 years ago, a small destroyer charged battleships. Logic said she'd be destroyed in minutes. She fought for over 3 hours. Logic said her crew would panic. They fought harder as the ship died beneath them. Logic said one destroyer couldn't change a battle. She changed the war. As you see on the screen now, there's a memorial to USS Johnston at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. It's a simple plaque with the ship's name, the date she was lost, and a list of the dead. Visitors sometimes leave flowers or coins, a Navy tradition. But the real memorial to Johnston isn't bronze or stone. It's in the doctrine taught to every Navy officer. The understanding that courage and initiative can overcome material disadvantage. It's in the stories told in ready rooms and wardrooms across the fleet. It's in the standard every destroyer crew holds themselves to. Commander Ernest Evans told his crew Johnston would be a fighting ship. On October 25th, 1944, off the coast of Samar, she proved it. Against impossible odds, outgunned beyond measure, already mortally wounded, she kept fighting. She charged when she should have run. She attacked when she should have hidden. She inspired when she should have despaired. And in doing so, she showed the world what an American destroyer could do when crewed by men who refused to quit. The ocean claimed Johnston that morning. But the memory of what she did, what her crew did, that's eternal. Every time a warship faces overwhelming odds and chooses to fight. Every time a commander puts mission before safety. Every time sailors look at each other and decide some things are worth dying for. That's Johnston's legacy. That's what a 2,100-ton destroyer with 5-inch guns taught the world about courage. Remember her name. Remember her crew. Remember Commander Ernest Evans standing on his shattered bridge, hand mangled, body torn by shrapnel, calmly giving orders to attack. Remember the men in the engine rooms who kept the ship running even as shells tore through the hull. Remember the gunners who loaded and fired until water reached their feet. Remember the sailors who abandoned ship and then spent 2 days in shark-infested waters, refusing to give up because their ship hadn't given up. USS Johnston, hull number DD-5587, lost October 25, 1944, at the Battle off Samar. 186 men died with her, but what they accomplished, what they proved, that lives on. The destroyer that charged battleships. The fighting ship that kept its promise. The crew that showed the world the true meaning of courage. They sailed into harm's way, and they never came back. But because they did, thousands of others did come back. That's worth remembering. That's worth honoring. That's worth telling their story over and over so it never fades.